Over 2 decades have passed since the genre got its moniker. The genre would end up splitting, with some games focusing on being massive and others focusing on smaller contained worlds. This has led to more popularity than the genre has ever before seen, including through the use of launching on different platforms besides just PC. Most famously, Sony and Sega were the first to go online with their console MMORPGs and MMORPGs of their own in the early 2000s, 2 titles that entered my orbit shortly after their launches and kind of would bring JRPGs to online RPGs too. I have been steadfast, however, that the consolization, as I'm dubbing it, of virtual worlds will lead to ultimately smaller, less in-depth worlds and is a negative in the big picture of things, at least when trying to make a massive world. I wanted to make this video because I feel like players don't really recognize the negatives that come with a game being primed or adapted to console, especially if it was built with that in mind. And not just because it can provide negatives, but that in the bigger scheme of things it seems to shrink the overall scale and ability to execute said virtual worlds too. The positives should and will be mentioned too, with plenty of good examples to choose from. I simply chose the biggest pioneers and the most popular. This is the story of console virtual worlds. I'd like to welcome this video's sponsor, Babel. Babel is a premium subscription-based language learning platform that is available in 14 different languages. It's developed by over 150 expert linguists, and Babel has already helped millions and continues to help millions more quickly and confidently have real-world conversations in a new language. Babel has Spanish and Portuguese, for example, so I can practice my Spanish and brush up on my Portuguese. What languages are you interested in? There's a good chance that Babel has it. Babel is special because it's scientifically proven to help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks. And the lessons themselves are also designed by real language teachers. The best part is, if you aren't happy with Babel, well, it offers a 20-day money-back guarantee, which means, what are you waiting for? Start now and start learning a new language in 3 weeks with Babel. Check out the link in the description to get up to 60% off of a lifetime subscription. Thank you to Babel for sponsoring this video. Sega would strike first with Phantasy Star Online, pioneering online RPGs on consoles and pioneering them, period, in Japan. Launching at the turn of the century in 2000, this was after the term MMORPG had been coined, though it wasn't commonplace yet, with multiple titles launching under the moniker, such as Ultima Online, Asheron's Call, and EverQuest. PSO, or Phantasy Star Online, was different though. PSO was almost the perfect game for consoles, having a more action RPG focus and style of play that lent itself very well to using a controller on a console like the Sega Dreamcast, the GameCube, and then the Xbox. PSO had little abilities, and more of a focus on attacking with your main weapons. The smartest part of the entire arrangement is the controller scheme didn't really affect the gameplay nearly at all because PSO divided its RPG and most of its social elements into hub zones where combat doesn't really exist. That's doubly worth mentioning because oftentimes the console versus PC war really is just kind of a proxy battle of controller support war. PSO was Diablo, with a third-person action combat style and a Japanese approach to gaming and immersion, which ended up being a magical formula that completely transformed their industry and still sees not only the success of PSO itself today, but the success of PSO's children too. Japan would strike with yet another industry-changing online RPG, being pretty much the pioneers of console online RPGs, just shortly after PSO's launch, May of 2002. Final Fantasy XI was far more massive by comparison to PSO too, and certainly for the time, making it, according to most, considered an MMORPG, and not just an MMORPG in the virtual world space. This was unique because Japan primarily had focused on cooperative online RPG play and still does to this day. Final Fantasy XI was really like playing a Final Fantasy game online, featuring the near exact same style of combat, but the magic was still there. The cooperative feeling you got playing with companion characters offline, you now would get in a new special way with real-life players online. But even the raids in Final Fantasy XI were for less players generally than a typical MMORPG raid, so it was still a different type of game. Both of these two titles would see immense success with similar, albeit different, overall formulas. But what is unique about these two titles the most is that the fact that they were originally created with and for consoles in mind, yet it didn't seem to hurt their gameplay execution in any way. In fact that they were specialized for consoles is what made them so successful, especially in an era where consoles were still king. The West would finally answer with a console online RPG of their own. Well, a couple. This time, none other than in the EverQuest universe, though not EverQuest 1 itself, but a spin-off title made for consoles dubbed EverQuest Online Adventures. EverQuest Online Adventures might have had its issues, as Metacritic states. Much like we have been explaining, the game loses some of its complexity in an attempt to appeal to console fans and work on a console. EverQuest Online Adventures was a different approach though, and one that I kind of found no faults with, and much like the previous two I mentioned as well. EverQuest Online Adventures was almost like doing a demo version of an already massive and successive MMORPG, and was quite beloved at that, considering it never quite got the same support, and it was shuttered quite quickly. Another interesting example is Dust 514. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, well, it never launched, so why are you using that as an example? But I wanted to use it because I think it's an interesting mix of a PC and console online game, having separate gameplay for both, but both tied together ultimately. At least, it was supposed to be. In a sense, it's almost like an expansion just for console gamers naturally, which I thought was an interesting idea. Too bad it had too many issues and never saw the light of day. I do think that this approach could be still done, but in this modern age it is far more likely to be found being done on mobile devices, and even then, mobile gaming can be an even worse form of consolization, having to further shrink the scope and scale of the game in nearly every way. I have been banging this drum for a while though. I just wish we could see more companion app mobile games, like ones that let you check the auction house, or message your friends, or do mini games or certain crafting, kind of like Ragnarok had. I just think that there is a massive wealth of innovation and money-making potential there that's just untapped, without having to fully commit to making a game for that specific platform. Things would change after 2010 and keep changing, because now we started to see different strategies being utilized by MMORPGs and MMORPGs attempting to attract console audiences. This is the period I actually call the Consolization of virtual worlds or MMORPGs. Neverwinter, Star Trek Online, ESO, and yes, even Final Fantasy XIV to a lesser extent, were all culprits. Starting with the first two, both games had their gameplay severely reduced in ways that allowed for console play, which for both series made for poor play when compared to the best games in those particular series. For example, Neverwinter Nights 1 allows you to do far more online than Neverwinter Online does, and it's not even close, having played it pretty religiously. However, it's a PC title, and it was exclusively for 16 years until it was recently ported to consoles. With ESO, it's interesting, right? Because the Elder Scrolls was already playable on consoles, and in fact, it's how I played them for the first time. The interesting parts are that the game is clearly designed for consoles in the case of ESO, seemingly first, with UI and abilities being intuitive for controllers and console players, while also trying to appeal to PC players with MMO aspects. The problem is it makes for arguably the worst combat in TES history, as it's non-ironically labeled the worst part of the game. This is not to say that ESO couldn't have just been more of an action game and the controllers wouldn't have thrived there, but it shows that there are issues with consolization, I believe. Finally, Final Fantasy XIV, to a lesser extent, is an example. While totally functional and successful as a PC title, it had to give up serious concessions to function on consoles as well. The best example of this is the combat system itself, which some might feel the GCD is long because of tactical reasons, but the GCD is long due to latency and consolization. Other things that are noticeable are having less than 250 and 200 player count caps for certain zones. I don't think it's debatable that although Final Fantasy XIV is perfectly fine on and off console, because the fact that it was engineered for consoles, it had to sacrifice aspects of its combat system and its massiveness for the worse. I mean, compared to any other Final Fantasy game, the combat, for example, probably is some of the worst. Though that doesn't mean that it isn't fun, clearly, especially with so much more to play and experience in Final Fantasy XIV, like for example the story. Still, it should be worth mentioning that even with a very fair approach like Final Fantasy XIV, there's still always going to be some type of technical limitation. My point ultimately wasn't to say that you can't have or you shouldn't have online RPGs, massive or not, on consoles. I think that there's been some great examples of this, some that have even pushed the industry forward completely. There are many ways to go about introducing a console or even mobile audience into the fold, and I applaud developers for attempting to do so, with so few doing it. The problem is the newer age of console-based virtual worlds had to make concessions I would argue in the end they were better off not making. Something I want to mention before console players feel too targeted here negatively is that I think that controller support on PC is a much better option and basically accomplishes the same thing. Now I know people will argue about that, but I have a PC and I don't have a console, so consoles for me aren't really an option. And consoles are just low-powered PCs, and the age-old arguments of cost these days don't really apply anymore. I know because I was there playing games when they applied. Anyway, while this is very opinionated of me to state, I feel us building virtual worlds for those dated consoles is holding and will continue to hold our industry back. And the final thing to end on is that the consolization of virtual worlds is directly opposed to pushing the limits, ultimately, of massiveness in a virtual world. What I mean is this. If you want MMOs to be as big as possible and feature crazy world-changing mechanics, maybe even be virtual worlds, and ask all of that to be possible on console, and asking all of it in this modern age is just asking for a lot of optimization, or in other words, heavily descaling aspects of the game. While in the future, if consoles even still exist as hardware platforms, it's possible massiveness could still be achieved and better achieved. It's just hard to argue it's going to be as easy when you're dealing with a less powerful piece of machinery, and a unwieldier one at that. Thanks for watching.